All right. Deficits, surpluses, and national debt. Oh, baby, this is good stuff, man.
That means it's hard.
No, it doesn't. It just means that it's good.
Depressing.
Maybe. All right, so this is all, I like starting off. This is the way I've started this off the last few years I've taught this class, right? On April 7th, 2009, our debt was 11 trillion, 152 billion, 772 million, 833,000, 835 and 89 cents.
You're nuts. I have to remember that.
Yes, you have to memorize that exact number. Obviously not. But this is to give you some perspective of how our debt is existing, right? This is 4 years ago, folks. Have we cut our debt or added to our debt in the last 4 years? Really? Are you sure? Well, okay, maybe a little bit. Okay, but please realize that this is a great number to write on paper. Why? Because if you're writing a paper, usually you're struggling to get to the number of pages that you need to reach.
And if you write it out in words, it's even more.
Exactly. I would write it out in words if I were you, just to be safe, right? I mean, come on. Trillions, billions, millions, thousands, hundreds, and the pennies. Don't forget the pennies, okay? Anyways, debt is nasty, okay? It's out there, but at the same time, we have sort of accepted the fact that it has to happen, right? I mean, that's what we learned last chapter, is that when we go into recessions and people are going to collect unemployment and there's going to be less taxes collected by the government, that it needs to be able to go into some debt. Some. What is some? Well, that's apparently what some is. Now, the other thing about it is that you may say, well, it's the government, right? They can just print the money and pay it off.
No.
Actually, the government doesn't have the right to print money. They pass that right over to the Federal Reserve. So in order for the government to get out of debt, they actually have to order the Federal Reserve to print the money. It's the U.S. National Bank, yes, but it is actually not run by the government. Right, so, yeah, it's a totally separate entity entirely. So that's why the government can't just immediately print 11 trillion little $1 bills and they just go out to people and hand them out.
And if they did that, wouldn't they devalue the dollar so very much that...
Yeah, basically it would create levels of inflation that the Federal Reserve wouldn't allow, which is why they wouldn't print the money to just pay off the debt. But theoretically, we could do it if we really needed to. I mean, it's not like it's a big deal, right? I mean, so what? If the U.S. dollar all of a sudden is not a viable currency anymore, what'll we do? Well, we'll start using euros or yen or, what the yuan? Is that what the Chinese monetary system is? Right? We should all start getting used to carrying around yuan. Once the Chinese finally let it become a free-flowing, monetary system, then since they're supposedly becoming better than us, that's what everybody's going to use instead of U.S. dollars, right? Me neither. But that's what everyone talks about, right? Because we're so far in debt, that's why China's going to take us over. It's because our debt, right? Well, I mean, if you listen to any of your congressmen or senators who are really worried about debt, that's the sort of thing that they would say, right? Is that, China's going to take us over because we're so far in debt. Scare tactics, right? Yeah. I mean, is that real? Well, okay. So... And we become walking zombies, and then, okay, sorry. Anyways, the question now is, how did we let ourselves get inside of this mess, if this is a mess? First thing that you need to know is the budget process that the government goes through every year, or technically every 2 years, really. So technically, in order for the government to spend even one of these pennies out of this 11 trillion some odd dollars back in 2009, technically someone had to pass a law that said we could do this every time, okay? There is no spending done by the government that has not been enacted into law. By law, the U.S. government cannot borrow or spend any money unless someone gives it say-so, all right? And that it is the Senate, the Congress, and the President, right? So the legislative and the executive branch have a little war every year around October, well, usually over the summer, where they fight about what the budget's going to be for next year. Right? I mean, you guys have been hearing it for the past 3 years, right? I mean, come August, September, that's when we start having our wars. Now, first thing to know about the budget. Fiscal year for the government is not the calendar year. It's actually October 1 to October 1. So the fiscal year for the government starts on October 1st, and then it ends technically on September 30th, but whatever. That's just the way they do it. Basically, the reason why is so that they can then take all of September and November off. Right? Normally, when are elections? Big elections. November, right? So from October till November, that's when most politicians will campaign. And then after they get elected, then they go on break. Well, they technically don't go on break, right? They have that little lame duck session for about a month. And then they go on Christmas vacation, which is like 40 days.
4 months long.
It's only a month and a half to 2 months, depending on who you are. Right? Generally, Congress gets some great work hours, folks. They get at least half the year off every year. Well, yeah. I don't know if anything that they're ever doing is contributing to GDP, but all right. Anyways, okay. So enough of our bitching aside. Let's move on into what we do at the budget process. It's considered a 3 or 4 stage process. Stage 1 can sometimes be considered 2 stages, depending on how you look at it. But the first and or second stage, depending on which economics book you happen to be reading. So where the budget starts is here, the OMB. Okay? The OMB stands for the Office of Management and Budgets. And in January, that's a J, they sit down and draft the first round of the budget. The OMB is an office that's completely handpicked by the president. So a lot of people will tell you that the Office of Management and Budget is supposed to be a bipartisan, nonpartisan committee of people. That's the biggest load of bahooey that's ever existed. If it's appointed by a president, it's going to be partisan, period, okay? Because the president is from a party. Therefore, he's going to pick people that are from the same party, right? Because the Office of Management and Budget people also get a decent salary. This doesn't take long. Usually the president sits down with his Office of Management and Budget and they crank out the budget. And the budget is something that's huge, right? I mean, we're talking about trillions of dollars, okay? So it's not trivial. But most of what the budget is doing is setting up guidelines for, you know, education. The Department of Education gets, you know, $450 billion. It's then the Department of Education's job to decide where does that $450 billion go. But so the budget's really just setting those limits that they give to each one of the departments. That's why all those 13 state department heads are such a big deal. Because once they get the money, they're the ones who decide where does it go, right? So when Tommy Thompson was head of, God, what was he head of? Health and Human Services, right. So they got a certain amount of money budgeted to them, and then it was his job to dictate where does that money go. Some of it goes to Medicare, some of it goes to Medicaid, some of it goes to welfare, etc., right? So the budget sets that up. Now, stage 3 or 2, depending on which way we're counting. Stage 1 is often called the president creates a budget, gives it to the Office of Management and Budget, who cleans it up. Right. Then stage 3, it goes to what's called the CBO. The CBO is the Congressional Budget Office. And the Congressional Budget Office is a congressional, again, it's very similar to the Office of Management and Budgets. It's just that this office or this department is created by congressmen who are on the Budget Committee. Right? So in Congress there will be a Budget Committee, and in the Senate there will be a Budget Committee, and those two groups of people get together and put all of the people on the Congressional Budget Office, who then dictate how the budget will be manipulated after the President and the OMB write it. When the budget gets passed from stage 1 or 2 to stage 3, the budget doesn't change. Right? So the CBO never changes anything in the budget. All they ever do is add stuff to it. This is where they do things called adding riders. You guys heard that phrase before, riders on the budget? Okay, what a rider on the budget is when, say, you know, the president says that we're going to spend $450 million or $450 billion on, you know, let's say defense. And the senator or the congressman from Texas who happens to be on the budget committee says, well, $450 billion isn't enough because that's not going to be able to cover some of the new expenses that we need for this next year. And so what they'll do is they'll put a rider on it saying we need an additional $250 million for, you know, building new Air Force airplane jets on top of the standard budget money that we already have that's going to pay for salaries and pensions and health care and all the other stuff that normally is covered by that budget allotment. And of course, the reason why the senator or congressman from Texas does this is because that's where Lockheed Martin is headquartered, is in Texas. And of course, if you give $250 million to the #1 industry in your state, what happens to your state? Well, it gets a lot more jobs, it looks a lot better, they collect a lot more taxes, and you know, so you look better. And you as a senator or a congressman, what happens when it comes election time next year? Or,
oh, you look awesome.
Hell yeah, you look great, right? So again, all these people are on this budget committee. There's 20 on each one from the Senate and 20 on the Congress. Well, I think there's 30 or 40 on the Congress side and 10 or 20 on the Senate side. Tell you what, here's some extra credit. Extra credit. Who is on the Congressional and Senatorial Budget Committee? I'll give you a hint. One of them is Paul Ryan. He is the head of the Budget Committee for Congress. Right? That's why he's such a big deal right now when it comes to setting up budgets, because he's the #1 guy that dictates how is the budget going to get changed from what the President and the Office of Management and Budget create initially. I don't know who's on it right now. Regardless, in stage 3, normally this goes until sometime in the summer, May-ish. Usually it's more like June or July. It hasn't been May in a long time. The last time the budget got actually sent past stage 3 in May was in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was really popular. So it's more, you know, I should probably just say June, July is more reasonable. All right. Again, it varies depending on what budget process you're going through. Whenever Congress has a majority in one party and the president is the other party, it always is more June, July, August-ish. Okay? I mean, that's just all there is to it. All right? Now, the last stage last, and again, whether you consider it stage 4, 3, whatever, is the president signs into law. Now, if Congress sends him a budget with a whole bunch of riders and changes and additional monies to spend, and the president doesn't like it, he can send back to stage 3. Basically, yes, he vetoes the budget and says, send it back to stage 3. As many times as you want. Yep. On the budget, the president has the final say-so.
Is there any way that like Congress and Senate can, in essence, make him sign it?
No, not the budget. Because it's not the entire Congress or the Senate that's necessarily creating the budget. It's purely these committees that are doing it.
He can try to force them to get to work by threatening a sequestration, which he did.
and had happened.
Successfully.
Whatever. Again, that was actually done by someone other than the president,
Well,
technically.
right, technically.
But the fact remains is that this has to pass into law. Now, the fact remains is that you've probably heard that there hasn't been a new budget passed by the Congress or the president in the last 2.5 years, right? We haven't had a budget passed in 2.5 years. So the question then is, wait a second, how is the government being able to spend any money if we haven't passed a law that lets them spend the money? Well, yeah, because they are sneaky. If you think about this, when was the last time the government shut down? Do you guys? No. 9/11. No, government didn't shut down last year. They threatened to shut down. They didn't. Some of you weren't born yet. Most of them, yeah, darn kids. It was back actually during Ronald Reagan's era when he was trying to break the airline strike, right? 86, yeah, 1986. See, so you were alive. You should know, Kim. So literally what President Reagan did was he said, look, the Congress had put in a rider that says we're going to pay the airlines more money. We're going to give them some additional money so they can afford to pay their unions more. And Ronald Reagan said, I'm not going to sign this budget into law with that additional rider added, period. And he's like, look, when October 1st rolls around, which is when the budget has to be passed in order for them to start spending for next year, he's like, look, if I don't sign it into law, you don't get any money. You don't get zero, right? So not only are we not paying the airline attendees who are paid by the government, but we're not paying for anybody else, right? And that happened for about, 5 days, was it? The government shut down. Nobody got paid. It's freaky. And a lot of people would go to work anyways, even though they knew they weren't getting paid. But, because they're government workers, right? And to work for the government, you kind of got to be a little, that's me. Anyways, what happened 2 years after that is they passed a new law called the Continuing Resolution Law. And what it states is that by law, if the budget is not passed, the government can assume that all budgetary process is carried over from one year to the next equally. So if the Health and Human Services got $450 billion last year, they get $450 billion this year. You can assume they're going to get it, and you may continue to work, right? So if the budget is not signed into law, the government can continue to work by carrying over last year's budget. Assume that whatever you said you were going to spend on stuff last year will be the same this year. And that's why all of this posturing and talking about how we're not going to pass a budget, we're never going to have another budget, blah, 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 is unimportant, because the Senate and the Congress and the President, when they were all run by the same party at the same time, agreed to pass this law so that when they were at odds with each other, the government would never shut down again. Okay? Now, there are issues with whether or not the government can borrow more money because of the debt ceiling, and there are issues as to whether or not we're going to continue to spend at the same levels that we're spending at. But passing the budget into law is now not a concern for Congress or, in theory, then, for any of us anymore. All right, so it's...
So why did they threaten sequestration in the first place if it was just going to continue from last year?
Well, because what was the spending last year?
Oh.
How much deficit did we generate last year? They generated a lot. And so what the group that created the sequestration law stated was, we don't want the same level of deficit added to this number again. And so they said, you must make cuts to do it to make it happen. And they passed that into law, and then it happened.
Right.
Is that a good or bad thing? I don't know. All right. So lots of places it sucked. All right, but this is a nice little, tidy little law that the Congress passed. It was in the mid to late 80s, I think, to basically not allow that same sort of government shutdown to happen again. All right, so the government decides we're going to spend $3 trillion. They only collect about $1.8 trillion worth of taxes in a given year. So we're spending $3 trillion. We collect 1.2. What's the difference? $1.8 trillion worth of debt. Where does the government get the money? Where does government get money over taxes? I mean, in theory, if they want to spend $3 trillion, they should have $3 trillion. In order to do that, they should raise the taxes first and then spend the money, right? I mean, that's in theory how we would all do it, right? Right? We would never spend any amount of money that we don't have, right? Right. Nobody has a credit card. Nobody's ever bought a house. No one's ever had a car loan. None of those things, right? You bought everything you bought with cash right on the barrelhead. That's the way it worked, right? Of course not, right? So the key here is that the government does not print money. Again, please realize that the U.S. government cannot print money. It backs the money, but it can't print it. It can't just make new money, period. That's the bank's jobs, right, which we'll do in chapters 18 and 19. So what the government does, the government, quote unquote, makes money, and I don't mean this as in they make it, by selling debt. And think of these debts as
That's like buying a house and filing bankruptcy.
well, yeah, if the government would file bankruptcy. I mean, they could get out of all of this debt if they wanted to by just saying, oops, we're bankrupt, sorry. All you people that we owe this money to, you don't get it. That would not go off well if we did do that, just in case you were wondering. All right, so they sell U.S. Treasury securities. Securities, notes, or bonds. So there's 3 different levels of U.S. debt that you can purchase. The term of the debt dictates whether it's called a security, a note, or a bond. Anything that is longer than 10 years worth of debt is considered a bond. So you can buy a 10-year bond, a 20-year bond, or a 30-year U.S. savings bond, right? If you buy something that's within 1 year to 10 years, it will be a note. It's considered a U.S. Treasury note. Anything that is less than 1 year's worth of debt is considered a security, okay? Nitpicky things. Those are not the sort of things I would ask on a test, but that's how they determine what they're called, just so that you know.
Who do they sell these to?
Anyone and everyone, right? I mean, some of it they sell to China, right? Again, this is another one of those things that everybody's really worried about, that China owns 5% of our debt. Everybody's like, oh my God, China owns us, right? First of all, 5% is nothing, folks. I mean, yeah, it's trillions of dollars, but right? All we have to do is go to war with them, and then all of a sudden that debt's gone. Mm-hmm. I mean, the first thing you do when you go to war with a country is all the debt that you owe them, you forgive yourself. Right, so that's exactly why China doesn't go to war with us, and why I'm not worried about China going to war with us. Because a good $1 to $2 trillion worth of their GDP, or their net worth, is stored in our debt. And if they go to war with us, all that's just going to be basically firewood. I mean, and it's kind of warm in China already, so they probably don't need it. I suppose maybe up in the northern regions, up by the Himalayas, maybe a little cold. They could burn it. But yeah, so don't worry about China. We want them to buy our debt, right? It makes them more reliant upon us. So yeah, it may sound like we're owing them, but that means they also need us, right? I mean, it's not a bad thing. Now, other people, of course, are also buying this. You and I are, right? I mean, what happens when your brother has a kid? What do? You go down to the bank, you buy him a U.S. savings bond, right? So that when they turn 21, they get their $100 savings bond to do whatever 21-year-olds do with $100. And I know nothing about it, so don't ask me. I'm too old.
That's why you look rough on Monday.
All right. So, and again, the other people that buy these things are companies and other countries, right? I mean, the number one purchaser of U.S. debt, though, is not China, it's not Japan, not any other country. It's ourself. Social Security Fund is the number one purchaser of U.S. debt. So the Social Security Fund, when you pay Social Security tax, please realize that you're not actually giving the government money, you're lending it to them, right? It's not even, honestly, I don't think we should call it a tax, because really what you're doing is giving money that's being put into a fund that when you retire, they will pay back to you, right? I mean, that's what Social Security is. It's a forced savings account. Not necessarily a bad thing to do. And if the government has, say, $50 to $60 trillion worth of money that we have been investing in the Social Security Fund over the last 80 years as a country, what are they going to do with that money? Are they just going to let it sit there? Of course not. They're going to spend it, right? I mean, or they're going to invest it, right? They may invest it in the market, or they may invest in countries. And what might the number one country that our own Social Security Fund would invest in? Our own country. So literally, there is about $4 trillion worth of our debt sitting in the Social Security Fund. I mean, people who say, well, there's not enough money in Social Security to pay us for the rest of our lives. I'm like, guys, that's because a lot of it's sitting there in IOUs from the government. Yeah, it's not cash, but hopefully to pay us back when the time comes, right? We hope. I mean, if they can't, well, then what's going to happen is that not just Social Security is going to fail, that's going to mean that the government failed. If the U.S. government fails, folks, you might want to get out. Canada might look pretty good then, even though even Mexico would look good at that stage, right? All right, so anyways, the fact remains is that everybody owns some of our debt. It's spread everywhere, okay? So it's not necessarily a bad thing that all of this debt exists. Should it be as high as it is? Well, I don't know. Yeah, there's a counter, if you will. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, the debt's going up fast enough per second that you can't even read the 1,000 numbers as they change. You have to get up to the hundreds of thousands or millions. Because we have lots of things to buy, folks. So we need to sell some debt. Again, is it good, is it bad? The other thing about that debt counter is that they don't really take into account how fast the government has to pay off the debt. Right? Realize that when one of these securities or notes or bonds is due and you go to cash it in, once you cash it in, what happens to our debt? It goes down, right? Because now they've paid off the debt. It's not on the books anymore. Those are not in those counters as much, because how do you know when they're going to get purchased back, right? I mean, it's a little tough. So those are rough estimates. I wouldn't go buy that one. That's more of a scare tactic than anything else. All right, so all of this, some of it being owed to ourselves, this leads us to another term. Net public debt. And that's actually the amount of debt that we owe to not ourselves, right? This is the part of national debt that is owed to non-U.S. government agencies. Please realize, folks, that the state of Wisconsin is also heavily invested in U.S. debt. Right? The pension fund that's run by the state of Wisconsin, it's money that I am paying in, and theoretically anyone else who is a state employee has to pay into their pension fund. again, that's money sitting in an account that's going to get invested in. They hope it's going to grow at a certain percentage rate. Where's some of that money going to wind up? Right? Every fund out there, every stock fund, every mutual fund, every portfolio that you have is going to have some measure of U.S. securities purchased on it. Right? These are one of the most secure forms of debt that you can have. Folks, this is the one spot where the U.S. is still number one. Our debt is the safest. Why?
Why is it security? That's why it's called security.
Potentially, yeah. But again, it's because our interest rates are the lowest. The interest rate on our debt is lower than any other countries in the world. Right? Our debt, a 10-year U.S. savings bond, will earn you 1.8% annual interest. That's it. Anywhere else in the world, if you invest in that country, they will pay you more. Greece, in order to, if you want to invest in the country of Greece, you can buy, Greek savings bonds. They pay 18% interest. Why? Because the Greek economy really sucks. And nobody trusts the Greek government, right? So they have to pay really high interest. Same with Italy, the same with France. Their interest rates are up there at 7, 8, 9% for their securities and their notes and their bonds. Only the U.S. is under 2%. Even Germany has to pay 2.1% interest on its savings bonds. I mean, we are the most secure. Don't ask me why. I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily trust my country either, but the fact remains that the people who have money see us as safe. And that's probably a good thing, right? Or at least I hope it is anyways. Now, so you've probably heard this phrase before, right? The debt ceiling, right? The maximum debt allowed by law. We do have a debt ceiling law that says we can only borrow so much money. Basically, it's not that we can borrow so much money. It's more along the lines of we can only sell or create so many treasuries, securities, notes, and bonds. I mean, that's more along the lines of what it is. So whenever we reach the debt ceiling, the government can usually shuffle money around so that they don't have to actually create more treasuries, securities, or notes to borrow. They'll borrow from a different account. So they'll say, that $450 million or $1 billion we gave to Health and Human Services, we can kind of go in there and take some out of there for a while first. And then when we get more money, then we'll put it back. Sort of like the right hand giving money to the left hand behind the back. Yeah, It's a little weird, but again, it's a game that you can play. As long as you're an accountant, it's okay. You do kind of got to be a nerd. All right, so more extra credit. How many times since 1912 has the debt ceiling changed or been reenacted into law? I mean, it's already happened twice in the past 3 years. How long has it been since 2000 or since 1912? 100 some odd years.
101 odd years.
Yeah, so 101 odd. It's going to make you sick when you see how many it is. Because, of course, every time they create that debt ceiling, the new number, they say, we'll never get this high, ever, never. Oh, yeah, well, it is what it is. So we have all of this debt, and one of your homework problems will be to figure out how much it is, which is why I don't bother looking it up, because it's going to be your job, not mine. It is odd, but not from the book. So, should we be scared? Should we be nervous? Should we be running in the streets screaming bloody murder?
You said we're
All right, so
Do we believe him? Can't I just buy 92 assault rifles and just put them in my house?
so the first question you might think that would come from this being scary is, can the U.S. go broke? Can we literally go broke? The fact remains, no. Right, and other countries won't let us. Why won't they?
If our economy falls, their economy falls too.
Yeah, I mean, who is the number one buyer of crap out in the world? Me. We do most of the buying, so if we go broke and declare bankruptcy as a country, the rest of the world will just follow right along in suit, okay? So they won't let it happen, on top of, theoretically, us not letting it happen to us either, okay? So there should be a certain amount of security in the fact that everybody else has as much a vested interest in us as we do, okay? Are we dooming our children to a life of servitude and debt where they are constantly going to have to be paying for all of our excesses? Well, I sure as hell hope so.
Why do you think you had children?
True, I should have had some kids so I could whip them into the workforce at age 16. Well, no, technology is what's giving them hope, in my opinion, right? So, are we just putting off the inevitable where we're going to have to make our kids pay off the debt that we accumulate? Well, maybe. Hopefully we're not really killing them. I mean, obviously this is a figure of speech. I don't really mean you should kill your children. That would be bad. Good. So don't kill them. The fact remains is that this is a standard ploy, or it's a normative economic statement that congressmen, senators, and presidents use to scare you into being worried about debt. This is not an economic argument that the debt has to be paid off sometime, and therefore, if we don't pay it off, it's going to be our children's job, and it'll be so high that they won't be able to afford it. This is mostly a scare tactic. Economically, all economists look at that as being bunk, right? It's just no. Yeah, it's a normative statement. It's what you say to scare people. So if you watch too much Fox News, they will tell you this all the time, right? That the debt is killing your children, and it's all your fault. If you would just pay off the debt, everything would be better. How would it be any better? I mean, think about it. If all of a sudden we all agreed to donate $10,000 to the debt, right? Imagine if you would take 10 grand that you earned this year and pay off the debt to you after you had to pay 10 grand to pay off the debt.
You'd be $10,000 poor.
You'd be $10,000 poor. Would you be able to afford to do anything for your children? No. Would you be able to buy food for your children? Potentially not. What would happen to your children? They'd be dead. Okay, that's the other side using scare tactics.
Spend that money.
Okay, so, I mean, yeah, eventually we're going to have to pay off the debt. But what I like to point out here is if you go to page 347 in the book, back in chapter 16. So one of the things that people say is that the interest is what's going to kill us, right? Because we're paying interest, and that interest is going to compound on itself, right? And so the interest payments alone are going to be what, destroys our children. So page 3, is it 347? Yeah, page 347 there in the pie chart. Back in 1970, what percent of our taxes were spent on paying off interest on our debt? 9%. 9% of the government tax that we collected went to pay off interest on our debt back in 1970. How much debt did we have back in 1970? Was it anywhere near 11 trillion? No. It wasn't even close to $1 trillion yet, really. I mean, well, it was getting close, but it wasn't there yet. 2010, what percent of our taxes are going to interest payments? 6%. It's gotten better. What the? Interest rates are tons lower, right? What were interest rates back in the 70s? 12 to 18%. Yeah, they were nasty high. All the debt we created back in the 1970s and 1960s cost us a ton, right? I mean, interest rates were up at 10 and 12%. I mean, good Lord, I would buy a U.S. savings bond if it paid 12%. I mean, come on, right? What's interest rates right now? 1.8%. Hello? That's like free money, folks. I think the government should be spending more because they can borrow it for cheap. When the money's cheap, that's when you borrow, right? Go just sell $15 trillion worth of debt right now. Just shoot it up there to 40 or 50 trillion. Why the hell not, right? If you're only going to have to pay 1.8%, shoot, come on, right? And it's only 6% of the taxes they're collecting anyways, right?
So why aren't you in the government now?
Well, no, this is why the government should continue to spend and why they shouldn't necessarily be worrying about it. Money's cheap. This is when you borrow. This is a good time to go into debt because interest rates are so low, right? This is when you want debt. You guys are lucky when you're young at this age because this is when you're going to be in debt, right? You can go buy a house, lock yourself in at 2.8% for 30 years. I mean, eventually interest rates are going to go back up. And once they're back over 2.8%, you're dancing your way to the bank for however many years you have to pay off that loan, right? Because that's free money, literally. I mean, yeah, you're paying off the principal, but you're not really paying any interest once interest rates are above that. That's kick-ass, right? I mean, that's why the government should, in my opinion, be going deeper into debt, not trying to get out of it. My opinion, of course. Why not? Why not? Well, there potentially will always be wars, but
If they could all direct his own step. If they could all agree to put on their grown-up panties and actually do some work, then yeah, the government.
well, I mean, they eventually we will turn around to the point where we're at recovery and we will start to have a surplus. And if we can keep ourselves from going to war, which we did back in 1994, 5, and 6 with Clinton, right? We could pay off some of the debt again, right? But I mean, well, we're going to go to war against ourselves because probably did they? Oh,
Maybe since we've been sitting in here.
interesting.
Because that's my.
Well, I don't want to know. So, oh no, I mean that's a relatively important point, right? I mean, because the more time you have these sorts of incidents, the more you think more wars are going to start, right? And what are more wars going to lead to? I mean, hello, folks. I mean, more debt, right? I mean, that's what the last two of them did for us. When we had surpluses, we went further into debt because we had to go to war, right? Because Boston or New York or World Trade Center or pick your favorite one, whatever, Kuwait. So. At this stage, yeah, I don't think it's that much of a problem, simply because, yes, we are going into further debt, but we're also collecting lots more money. We are, as a country, way the hell more productive in 2010 than we were in 1970. I mean, we are tons more productive. We produce more, we generate more revenue, and because we're generating more revenue, even though tax rates have gone down, the government collects more, okay? All we have to do is, at some stage, finally say, okay, we don't need to necessarily fund everything that we're funding, have a couple of good years of surplus without having war, and yeah, we can start lowering these debt liabilities. And again, realize that most of the debt that's disappearing, the debt that we're paying off, that's the high interest stuff. Any new debt that we're creating, 1.8%. Which means the interest rates are they're going down all the time. Average interest on our debt is going down continuously. Crank it up, right? Because if they're paying off 30-year loans, right, back in 1982, interest rates were literally 13%. Those are the ones they're paying off, those 30-year bonds. Those people are crying because they were making 18% per year. Some bastards. I wish I had had money back in 1980 and the wisdom to buy U.S. savings bonds. So regardless, are we, eventually someone does have to pay it off, but is it necessarily out of control yet? I don't think so. Again, you can say that it is if you want, and I would probably buy it to some degree, but don't sweat it too terribly much. Now, the true economic scare. Yes, exactly, is the crowding out effect. This is what I want you guys to be able to argue about. Those two things in the top, you can use those whenever you need to against your friends who are idiots. That's fine, right? So if you want them to be scared, you can start talking about how debt is going to kill your children. I mean, now that you've gone through this class, you now know that debt will not kill your children. It'll just mean that, they have to work a little bit harder. It's probably good for them anyways, darn it. Stupid video game playing,
But we're the idiots that buy it for them.
Shh. All right, so the real scare that economists worry about when it comes to this debt is the crowding out effect. And the crowding out effect, what that is when a government gets too far into debt. And again, too far is a subjective term. I can't quantitatively give you a number for it. I just can't. I tried to do that when I first started teaching this class, like 4 or 5 some odd years ago. I said, if we ever get debt up to $13 trillion, that's the point when things are going to hit the fan. We hit 13 trillion, 2 years ago. And has the stuff hit the fan yet?
No.
Tells you what I know. Okay? So I'm just going to say too far and leave it at that. All right? When government gets too far into debt, the interest that government pays on debt, the interest that government pays on debt will rise. I mean, eventually people are going to get worried of not being able to pay off your debt, right? I mean, eventually someone's going to look at the debt that our country has, right? 16 some odd trillion dollars, and they're going to say, are they really going to pay this stuff off? And if they say, no, they're not, then the government, instead of only giving them 1.8%, will have to give them, say, 2%. And once the government has to start raising interest rates to borrow money, what happens the next time they go to borrow more? They got to raise them even more. And they got to raise them even more. And when U.S. government debt interest rates go up, so do all other interest rates. Okay? This will make all other interest rates rise. So imagine again, right? So think, say 2 or 3 years, or maybe even 2 or 3 months, depending on how things are going. You never know. I mean, where is too far? I don't know. I won't even speculate. But eventually, all of a sudden, interest rates start to go up on our debt. The government will have to pay 2%. Maybe we'll get to 2.2. Maybe we'll get higher than Germany and Switzerland and Norway and all the other really good countries out there. And when this starts to happen, all of our interest rates will go up with it, right? Because most of the banking industry is also invested in government debt. And in order for them to make money, they have to charge more interest than they're making on this money, right? So normal debt, normal loans that you and I get, right? I mean, you can get a loan right now for like 3%. The reason why? Government debt's 1.8%. Once government debt goes up to, say, 2%, our loans will go up to 3.5%. When that number goes up to 2.5%, our home loans will go up to 4%. There's a direct relationship between those two things, all right? And when interest rates start going up, what do we as consumers do? Do we buy more houses? No, because now they cost more, right? So we start to spend less, right? So here's the crowding out. The higher interest rates lead to a reduction in C and I, in consumer spending and business investment, right? Is a business going to start up a new factory if the interest rate they have to pay is 8% instead of 2%? No. This is what everyone was crying about when the government first started spending money back in 2009. When we first wrote that, $800 billion or $1.2 trillion stimulus package, the real economists and even some of the real politicians said, what's going to happen? We are going to have an interest rate boom. We're going to see huge inflation, right? That's what they expected. Lots of spending and spending and spending. They're like, oh, here comes major, humongous inflation, and with it, higher interest rates. And all that higher interest rates will do is crowd out all the spending that would have been done by consumers and businesses. And they were, even Fox, I had to agree with them, right? They were screaming the same thing. I was like, oh, crap, they're right. But we did it. We spent all this money. What happened to interest rates? Nothing. What happened to inflation? Did we get tons of really nasty inflation? No. So it kept not happening. So what did they have to do instead? Yeah, they told us we were killing our children instead of creating hyperinflation, right? That's what changed. If you think about it, from 2009 to 2010, the conservative pundits changed their story from here comes nasty inflation to, oh my God, you're killing your children. Quit it. Right? Because the real economic argument that they had didn't turn out to be true. This is a very good economic argument, though, right? I mean, it really does make sense. The problem is the interest rates haven't gone up. Right? Because we haven't gotten too far yet. Where's too far? I don't know either. Yeah. It is scary, though, because think about it, right? Think about the fact that this happens, right? So the government has to start borrowing money and interest rates go up. And they're borrowing money because they want to push it into the economy so that consumer spending and business investment will go up, right? Well, if by the government borrowing, they force these two numbers down, that means they're going to go deeper into a recession. So what does the government need to do? They need to borrow even more, though, right? Because they're the ones who would push the economy forward, right? You need to pump aggregate demand. These are falling, so you really need more G. But the interest rates are already too high, so uh-oh. I mean, this is what happened to Greece, folks. This is exactly what happened to Greece. They got to the point where they were in a nasty recession. They tried to borrow money, and people said, we don't trust you. We won't lend it to you. And Greece said, we're in a recession. We can't collect enough taxes to pay for our unemployment. What are they going to have to do for all the people that are on unemployment? Stop paying unemployment because they had no money. They literally did go broke, right? Until the International Monetary Fund and the German people stepped in and said, here's a whole bunch of money that we'll let you borrow from us anyways. Could that happen to the U.S.? Sure. Why not? Again, though, a lot of other people would have to suffer in the process. So, when you should be worried is when you start to see interest rates going up. If the U.S. government is still borrowing money and you see interest rates going up, that's when you should get nervous. Because that's when this crowding out effect will start happening. That's when you can start seeing problems in the economy that are not fixable. All right? This is a great argument. This, just as a side note, and we'll get to this more when we get to chapter 20. This is what is known as a monetarist's argument. So when Keynesian economics came around, all of this, the government needs to spend money in order to get us out of a recession, and it worked, right? So think Great Depression, right? That's what the government did. They started the public works programs that drove our economy to recovery. The classical economists who said you should do nothing, right? Remember, that's what classical economists always say. They say, let the price system do it. Don't screw with the economy. You're just going to make it worse, right? Well, their ideas didn't work. And the Keynesian stuff did, and it has for the last 60 or 70 some odd years. These are what are known as graduated classical economists, monetarists, and we'll learn about them in chapter 20. But that's just a little preview for them. This is what their biggest argument is, right? And I heard a great speech by Paul Ryan when we first started going into debt that was basically this argument. I thought, wow, he does have a degree in economics. Because he used it, and it was intelligent, and it was good. And literally, like 9 months later, what was he telling us?
Showing our children.
Yeah. I was like, oh, you went from being an intelligent person to being, you know, it's like, you know, he's going to look even more stupid when he does it than I do. Okay, so.
And then run for vice president.
All right, homework. Nothing from the book, because the book questions all suck.
Oh, okay.
So find out what our national debt was on January 1st, 2013. Please, when you look this number up, use a .gov website. Do not go to fox.com and look it up. They'll tell you it's like 30 trillion or something like that. Yeah, Wikipedia is not really a good one either. That depends on who wrote that particular or fixed that particular argument. Yeah. Good idea. All right. So that's national debt. Then I want to find net public debt. So take that number and tell me how much of it is really owed to other people other than the U.S. government itself. Right? So a lot of what the government owes, half of our national debt is owed to ourselves, which is another reason why I don't worry about national debt too terribly much, because if we could just forgive ourselves, it would go half away. But we're not very forgiving if you think about it. Find out how much GDP was in the year 2012. So figure out how much money or how much goods and services we produced in a given year. Compare what our GDP is to our national debt. So if we decided one year to just pay off debt instead of collecting salaries, would we be able to pay off the debt in 1 year? And then last but not least, find out how much we paid in interest on our national debt in 2012. So find what we paid in interest on our debt in 2012. So just, again, you should be able to find how much our debt payments were on the same website you find national debt on. They usually are together.
With the GDP and comparing it, you just want to know what GDP was compared to national debt, and
Yeah.
like
What the difference is. Yeah. Subtract the two numbers.
Okay.
Don't forget your extra credit. 2 questions, right? Find who's on the budget committees for the Senate and the Congress, and how many times the debt ceiling has changed. Fun little searches. Sure, no problem. Stick around, Amanda. Nice.